Hi, I'm Kathy Brasby. This is our first lesson looking at the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth has always fascinated me. It is not your classic romance, and it is not written just to women. This book, in incredible literary form, examines the nature of God when it appears he has failed. That's a question that certainly resonates with us today, because sometimes it looks to us as well as though God has failed. Where are you in all this mess of our lives? But you know me. First, we have to look at some background. We will look at the first verse in just a bit. But right now, I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the Book of Ruth and the time of Ruth. In the very first verse, it tells us that this story takes place in the time of the judges. What in the world does that mean? Well, the time of the judges, and this is in Old Testament times, was when the Israelites, these were God's chosen people, had settled into the land that God had promised them. God had rescued them from Egypt, where they were in slavery, and then through Moses brought them out of that slavery and into the promised land. So for the Israelites, we already see a theme, a big overarching theme for their lives to this point, and it is to go from catastrophe to fullness. In Egypt, they were in slavery, oppression, they had no freedom, and now they come into God's chosen land, into fulfillment. That idea of going from disaster to fulfillment is a part of the Israelites' story. That is also part of the story of the Book of Ruth. In both of these stories, we look at how God has intervened for his own. But let's talk a little bit more about this time of the judges, because you would think after God had brought his people out of the oppression and slavery of Egypt into a land that he gave to them, you would think that they would stay devoted to him forever. Now we see they start out really well. Let's look at Judges 2 in verses 6 and 7. And when Joshua dismissed the people, this is when they first came into the promised land, the Israelites went to their allotted portions of the territory, intending to take possession of the land. This was part of the plan for them. The people worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime, and as long as the elderly men who outlived him remained alive. These men had witnessed all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. So the Israelites got off to a great start. They remembered it first, but it wasn't long, maybe just another generation before things went downhill, because we read a summary, and still in Judges 2, in verses 11 and 12, the Israelites did evil before the Lord by worshiping the Baals. They abandoned the Lord God of their ancestors, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods, the gods of the nations who lived around them. They worshiped them and made the Lord angry. We might at first wonder, what on earth is wrong with these people? They had just seen God rescue them, bring them to a land of their own, and now they are just taking in the gods of the people around them. But think about it like this. They came into this land that God described as a land of milk and honey, and perhaps they said, how did it get this way? Maybe the gods that are here helped make it this way. These other gods seem to be providing rain at the right time. The sheep, the goats were multiplying at the right time. Maybe these gods were doing their part as well in this new land. So it was easy to slip into the place of saying, what could it hurt? We will continue to serve Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, but what could it hurt to just go ahead and serve these other gods, just in case they could add something to the mix? I think it was just in case kind of thinking. What could it hurt? We'll serve Yahweh, a little bit for the other gods. We want to ensure that our crops are prosperous, that our families are healthy. These were the goals of the people of Israel. But because they chose to serve these other gods, it wasn't long before their zeal for Yahweh began to cool. And they left worship of Yahweh behind to worship the other gods. What this brought in the time of the judges was chaos. We are told each man did what was right in his own eyes. They were no longer seeking God's leadership. They had no king at that time. They all did what was right in their own eyes. That's a recipe for chaos. So the book of Ruth takes place in that time. It was a very chaotic, tumultuous time. There was much cruelty, even among Israelites, one to another. If you have ever read the last few chapters of the book of Judges, you will know what a rough and cruel time this was. When each man did what was right in his own eyes, it was never good for most of the people. So in that time, we have political unrest. We have invading armies. We have gender inequality, racial prejudice, injustice, violence, economic crisis. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? They were chaotic times, dark times. And we have experienced some of that even today. The question in the book of Ruth was, where is God in all this? Why hasn't he intervened? Why has he not stopped these things? We may ask that question today, which is a good reason why we can begin to dig into Ruth and see what we can find out. So that is probably the big question in the book of Ruth is, where is God when things go bad? Who is God? What is the nature of God in those tough times? So as we go through the book, we'll be exploring the character and the nature of God. So let's go ahead and jump in. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. There's a whole lot more information here than we might think at first glance. We've already talked about the time of the judges. Let's see what else we can unpack from this verse. We see a famine here. It meant no food, which led to malnutrition and death. For some of us, we've never experienced something this devastating in our lives. But today, in parts of the world, people do experience a famine. We've seen pictures of little children. Their bones are just protruding because they are starving to death. And many of them eventually do. It is a real problem even today in parts of the world. But as I said, for some of us, that disaster doesn't hit us. We are not devastated by a famine, but a disaster can come in many forms. For a lot of us, this pandemic in the last year, and it's still ongoing, has challenged our faith in some cases. Where is God in the midst of this? Why didn't he stop this? Why didn't he prevent it? We've seen other things. Here in Colorado, we had massive forest fires in the mountains this summer. Many people lost their homes up there. It was disaster. It was a really difficult time. Why didn't God stop that fire? We've seen riots across the country. We've seen violence. Where's God in that? Sometimes it's more personal for us. We lost a loved one. Maybe we got laid off of our job. Maybe our health is deteriorating. There can be so many disasters that loom in our lives, big and small, and we can tend to say, where is God? Why didn't he stop this? Has he left us? Has he turned his back on us? Or maybe he's not powerful enough to overcome this particular disaster. These are the kind of questions that are roaming around in the very beginning of the book of Ruth. One of the consequences of a disaster that we become aware of, whether it's something personal or something we see that we are empathetic to, is that it causes us to examine where we put our trust. If our trust is based on something that proves to be too flimsy, we don't get the support that we're looking for. And that may be what happened to the man in our story. Go back to Ruth 1. Disaster hit Bethlehem in the form of this famine. Now, Bethlehem was deep in the promised land, in this land that God had given his people, in the area reserved for the tribe of Judah. This was God's country. This was God's promised land. Where was Yahweh in this situation? Wasn't this supposed to be the land of milk and honey, and now we have a famine and we're starving to death? I could see how that could produce a questioning of your faith in Yahweh. Now, something else we need to notice, that Judah, as I said, was in God's country. If you remember at the end of the verse, this man took his family, his wife and 2 sons, and went to Moab. This is a different country. This is not God's country. Moab was considered in those days the territory of the god Chemosh. Now, in those days, everyone was religious. They all had some form of God and worship. It was believed everything was caused by the gods. When the rain fell, when your lambing season came, etc., etc. And of course, everyone chose gods to follow. In many cases, there were several. They might have a god for fertility, a god for health, a god for the fire, a god for the storms, etc. They had many gods. Now, ironically, we have many gods today sometimes. Do we believe that a god or the god is responsible to keep our car running, responsible to get us to a meeting on time, responsible to keep us healthy, all without much regard for our input? For example, maybe you got caught in a traffic jam and you're going to be late for a meeting because you left home 20 minutes late. Maybe you expect God to take care of your health even though you don't eat very well and you don't exercise. But some of us still blame God when things go wrong in our lives. Today we don't generally name our gods. We generally acknowledge one God, but we tend to blame God or gods for anything that makes us unhappy or even inconveniences us. So we need to examine our own faith walk and our own faith foundation as well. But let's get back to our story. People then believed they had to do certain things to keep the gods happy. If the gods weren't happy, then catastrophe might descend on them. If the gods weren't happy, maybe the rain wouldn't come. If the gods weren't happy, maybe the gods would send storms. You've seen pictures of this idea of Zeus sitting on a cloud throwing thunderbolts down to the earth. This was kind of the understanding. What do we need to do to have these gods do what we would like them to do? So back to our family who moved to Moab. It may have looked to them like Chemosh was doing a lot better job in the land of Moab than Yahweh was doing in Bethlehem. We don't know, but we know that they went and there was food in Moab. Gods in those days were believed to be territorial. So the idea was that Chemosh was the god of Moab. He wouldn't venture into Bethlehem or Judah because that was Yahweh's territory. And unfortunately, some people thought Yahweh was limited to that land of the Israelites, that he could never operate in any other lands. So the man in our story may have felt that Yahweh was maybe offended in some way, and that's why the crops had failed. Since things were fine in Moab, maybe the Moabites had done a lot better job of keeping Chemosh happy. Maybe it was worth going there for a time. Those could be some of the things that were going through the mind of this man in our story. Now, I want to tell you that worship of Chemosh was vile. It was obscene. The things they did or thought they needed to do to keep this false god happy would horrify us. Children were often sacrificed to this god with the idea this would make him happy and he would provide them with good crops. That was in line with the thinking of that day, that you had to do the best you could to keep the gods happy so they would bless you with their favor rather than respond in anger. So for this man, this Israelite, to go from Bethlehem to Moab at least suggests that he may have had a crisis in his faith. It's possible that he went just because his family was in danger of starving to death and he didn't know what else to do. So we can understand, and I don't mean to be critical of him, we can understand why he would take his family to Moab. There were certainly dangers there in terms of what he was going to put his family through in this foreign country. So this man, we don't know if this was a failure in his faith. Did he wonder if Yahweh had turned his back on his own people? What's interesting about this book is that we don't really know what his motivation was. But then this isn't his story. This is his wife's story. How she wrestled with what God was doing in her life. And we will see next time a little more about this world of patriarchy that existed in those days and how unusual it was we'd have a story written about women who were wrestling with God. But that'll be for another lesson. So we have established our setting for this story. Starts out in Bethlehem of Judah. The story took place roughly 1200 BC. It was after the time of Moses, before the time of King David. We are also told in one verse the context of this story about how the Israelites were in hot pursuit of false gods, that they were joining with their neighbors in idolatry. And this was the sin of the book of Judges. The book of Ruth, therefore, will examine Yahweh's character. How does he compare with these other gods that the Israelites have chosen to follow? We will see that Naomi suffered through a famine. She became a refugee and endured the death of her husband and her two sons. We will see in our story that Naomi questions God's love. And really, God is the main character. It is God's character that we will be looking at. We will examine how God looks to Naomi, to Ruth, to Boaz in our story. How do they see God? How do they respond to God? And how does God answer their questions? So as we close out the lesson and prepare to dive in further into the book of Ruth next time, there's a few things that I want you to keep in mind. First off, this is not an American or a Western book. Our culture has very little place in this book, and it will be a challenge for us sometimes in the West to really understand how things work. In that culture, a woman got her value from a man. A woman's first her father, then her husband, and then hopefully sons. Sons were the gold standard for a woman. If she wanted social standing, she needed sons. Conversely, a woman without a man at that time was a zero in the culture. She had no value. But we're not really going to be wrestling with patriarchy. That's not the purpose of the book. Patriarchy only provides a cultural backdrop. It's something else that I think is really cool in the book, is that it fits into God's bigger picture throughout both the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. We get to see image bearers. These are people who put their trust in God. Image bearers have the privilege of reflecting the nature of God and also looking after things in his world. Image bearing is not a spectator sport, but it is a vocation. It is a call to action. Do these image bearers reflect the nature of God, and are they called to action in his name? And we will see by the end of the book how these actions of Naomi, of Ruth, of Boaz, our main characters in the book, how their decisions and choices impact not only their lives, but it's a much bigger impact that they have as image bearers. So stay tuned for that as well. If you haven't read the Book of Ruth, read it this week. It's a short book, but it's a powerful book. It's great to read it at one time. In our next lesson, we will meet Naomi and Ruth. Hope to see you then.